Hello and welcome back to the channel. 2024 marks the 33rd Modern Olympiad. Athletes, hosts, and fans will pile into Paris in late July and early August for the Games. As a host city, Paris has done an enormous amount of work in preparation to get ready for the event, including building or rehabilitating an entire Olympic village, complete with events venues, training sites, accommodations, and more for the athletes and guests. Did you ever wonder about the FIRST Olympiad? That took place in 776 BCE in Olympia, a sacred religious town in Greece. Last time we visited the religious area, and you can find a link to that visit in the description box below. They had much the same kind of facilities: a racetrack, a track for horses, an Olympic village, including training grounds and accommodations for the athletes, the trainers, and the guests. Much has been discovered and documented. More remains to be found. Let's take a look today on the Armchair Traveler. My name is Judy, and I love travel, history, and finding out what makes people tick. If you're enjoying my content, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your help means more people will see my content. If you want more information, I have a WordPress blog, a page on Facebook, and a Twitter handle. The addresses are here or in the information block at the bottom of the screen. Thank you and enjoy your visit. This map, which comes to us courtesy of Wikipedia, gives you an idea of the extent of the original site, which is still being excavated and documented. The main sanctuary area, called the Altus, was first in use perhaps as much as 2,500 years ago or more. In 776 BCE, the Games were added to the site, with additional facilities being added around the perimeter of the area. The ancient sanctuary area was originally surrounded by walls on three sides and bordered by Mount Kronos, the hill you can see to the north at the top of the map. All Greeks knew what those walls meant. This was an area for prayer and contemplation. Outside the walls was another matter. Just outside the boundaries of the Altus and to the west are the remains of what we'd think of as the Olympic Village, with athletic training grounds, accommodations for the athletes, and a bath, as well as quite a bit more yet to be identified. To the north is a long walkway past later baths that leads you through a sacred arch and into the stadium. Let's check out that gateway next. Modern scholars and archaeologists have set up a gateway arch in place, much as they believe it would have looked when the Games began in 776 BCE, or perhaps a little bit later. The photos suggest that this entire entryway might have been roofed over, perhaps a bit like the entryway for football players coming out of their dressing rooms into a modern stadium. Once you pass through the stadium gateway, you find yourself inside the stadium itself. After all these years, including earthquakes and mudslides, it's a little difficult, in my opinion, to say with much certainty how big the bowl was initially, but I was told it was around 700 feet long and perhaps 100 feet wide. The view from just inside the entryway shows us that at least part of it had permanent seating, although almost all of the rest of it has vanished. This was where they ran their races. The track was made out of hard-packed clay, and the facilities included something analogous to modern starting blocks, where the athletes would have lined up to make sure they all ran the same distance. And just like today, on one side of the track there was an area where the judges sat. Races in the Olympics were not confined just to human beings. Horses raced as well, either individually or on chariots. Google Earth reveals an area labeled as the Hippodrome, just south of the stadium, although it's been so overlaid by later buildings it's hard to make it out. Based on other racetracks scattered throughout Greece and later parts of the Roman Empire, this would have been a fairly large area, perhaps oval-shaped, nearly 2,000 feet long and perhaps as much as 650 feet from one side to the other. That comes to about a mile in diameter, almost the same as a modern racetrack like the Red Mile in Lexington, Kentucky. I've attempted to show you the general area and size of the place, although it extends somewhat outside the modern visiting area. The Hippodrome mostly hosted chariot races with different equipment and numbers of horses. One of these was included only for about 60 years. You might have called it a temporary game, and was called the Apine. It featured chariots pulled by mules. Near the Hippodrome are the remains of a building that's been labeled the House of Nero, which might or might not have had anything to do with the famous emperor. The brick construction does suggest that it might have been an imperial-era building. Nero was entitled. He became emperor in 54, Common Era, at the age of 16, and his 14-year reign was marked by a string of scandals, excesses, and atrocities, not to mention the murder of both his mother and his sister. History tells us that Nero thought he could do everything better than anybody else, and there was no one around to explain to him that he was wrong. He was apparently keen to participate in the games, not just as an observer, but as a competitor. In 67 AD, the games were actually moved up 2 years ahead of schedule to match up with the emperor's grand tour of Greece. Nero actually did compete as a charioteer in the race. He didn't win. He had a 10-horse chariot, the story goes, that he couldn't control, got dumped from the basket, and was badly injured. Nevertheless, he declared himself the winner. Not every Greek city-state could afford to put up a temple or even an altar to its favorite deity, but many of the states are represented here in a row of treasuries, shown in this remarkable photo captured by a drone. The treasuries were small, temple-shaped structures put up by the various colonies and towns to store offerings given by their people or the cities themselves. They stand on a natural ledge at the bottom of Mount Cronus. Each building had an entrance hall with 2 columns and a small storeroom in the back. I know that each of these tiny buildings, like a little bank, held what they called votive offerings, gifts from the ancient Greeks and Romans later on, given to the deity as thanks for bringing good fortune or when they were asking for favors. They might have included statues or armor, and I suspect some of the offerings were quite valuable. I have not been able to find out how these buildings and the contents were secured. They sit just outside the sanctuary area. Perhaps they were close enough that a thief would not think to enter. No empire lives forever, and that was quite true of the Greeks. Eventually, the Greeks were vanquished and replaced by the Romans. The games continued on for quite a while, and there were more visitors and the need for additional facilities, including places to stay, baths, and fresh drinking water. At its greatest, Olympia might have played host to as many as 10,000 visitors during the game. Olympia sits at the edge of the Cladius River, which the athletes, trainers, and administrators would have used for fresh water, as well as using wells. When the crowds arrived for the games in the summer, however, those facilities would have been overwhelmed. The Nymphaeum here in Olympia was more than just a drinking fountain. It was part of a water distribution structure built by the Romans, the end point of an aqueduct designed to bring fresh water into this part of the city. In Olympia, the average high temperature in August is close to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Everyone, athletes, trainers, permanent officials, staff, judges, and all the visitors were hot, dusty, and sweaty, and thirsty. One of those overheated visitors was a man named Herodes Atticus, who came here with his wife. Herodes was a wealthy Greek-born Roman senator in the 2nd century CE. He was also a philanthropist. He built this Nymphaeum and apparently included among the decorations statues and dedications to himself and his wife. The gymnasium was part of the athletic training facility, northwest of the Altus, or sanctuary, and located on flat land quite close to the river. The gymnasium was used by runners and pentathlon athletes for training immediately preceding the Olympic Games. I've marked the extent of it on this Google Earth image with red arrows. While I couldn't find a model or a drawing of it, as it might have looked when it was new, there's enough left of the foundations to give us some idea. The building had a series of columns surrounding an open courtyard where men could practice, and the area between the columns was covered. It measured about 200 feet long by 200 feet wide. What we see today is a little misleading because only one side of the colonnade has survived, although excavations are ongoing. The other thing we know is that if they wanted to practice in bad weather, they were able to practice undercover. The Palestra is a square-shaped building with another colonnade running all the way around, surrounding an open courtyard. It was connected to the gymnasium. The facility provided training and practice grounds for 3 martial arts: wrestling, boxing, and a kind of freestyle hand-to-hand combat called pankration. The training was standard schooling for young men in Greece between the ages of 18 and 20, and was designed to prepare them for adult life, including service in the military. These were the skills that a soldier would need to fight and survive. The Leonidon sits just south of the Palestra and gets its name from the man who designed and paid for it, Leonidas of Naxos. It had a covered colonnade on all 4 sides with an open peristyle. Athletes stayed here during the games until they ended. In the late 3rd century CE, the building, which is still in use at the time, was destroyed in an earthquake, and the wreckage was recycled into some of the city walls. Wealthy donors today still name buildings and public works after themselves, not just to get credit in the moment, but so they'll be remembered long after they are dead. Leonidas of Naxos was no different. We know he was a Greek architect, and he designed and paid for this building himself. He must have had quite a life, and perhaps had been politically prominent in his day, but that was all I ever was able to find out about him. These baths, which go under the name of the Leonidan Thermae, are located quite close to the hostel we just visited. This was a fairly large structure and quite modern compared to much of the rest of the site. The baths were probably built in around 100 CE. Archaeologists believe they were set up much like Roman public baths that we've seen before, with hot and cold plunge pools, changing rooms, perhaps even a bathtub, and lavatories. Unlike earlier Greek-style facilities, which were mostly for post-training cleaning purposes, this Roman-style bath was a place for visitors to socialize, relax, and chit-chat. Those long bricks give away the fact that this was much later Roman construction, possibly set on top of something earlier. Inside, the chambers must have been lavishly decorated, complete with mosaics, a small sample of which you can see here. The statue of Zeus was a giant seated figure, about 40 feet tall, made by Phidias himself around 435 BCE. We don't have the statue today. It disappeared apparently sometime in the 5th century CE, but we still know quite a bit about it because it was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world and was described. The statue was built out of thinly sliced ivory, applied over a wooden frame, then decorated with gold leaf and more. Zeus sat on a painted cedar wood throne ornamented with ebony, ivory, gold, and precious metals. The fact that even seated, the figure was 40 feet tall gives you some idea of the dimensions. Phidias and his statue set an artistic style or model that persisted to at least the beginning of the American Republic. This statue of George Washington by artist Horatio Greenenough is in the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., and bears more than a passing resemblance to the original on which it was modeled. You might be asking yourself how we know after all this time that this was really Phidias's workshop. The location outside the sanctuary area means it could have been some secular space, and its size and shape mean it was big enough to build some fairly large constructions. Our friend Pausanias, a famous Greek tourist who spent the last 30 years of his life day tripping all over Greece, vouched for Phidias as the creator of the enormous statue. Phidias came from Athens originally, and Attic Greek would have been the dialect that he spoke and wrote. According to the Archaeological Museum, some enterprising person unearthed this red wine bowl. It's very difficult to make much out of it, with an inscription that read, more or less, "I belong to Phidias." There was an enormous amount of excitement about finding something that belonged to the master. I even took a photo of the explanation along with one of the remains, although it's not a very good picture. Everyone believed the story, mostly because they wanted to. There were some discrepancies, however, that led experts to start asking questions, and they've been fighting about it ever since. Eventually, some pesky scholar took a close look. In the area around Olympia, the people would have spoken a different dialect called Elean. He asserted, to international acclaim and curiosity, that the cup had to be a phony because anything written in the area would have been written in that dialect. He ignored the fact that Phidias was from Athens and spoke Attic Greek. Was the cup real? Was it a clever forgery? Was it an incompetent forgery? I don't think we'll ever know. Cologne is a pleasant seaside town that caters mostly to tourists who come to visit Olympia. The town itself is just 5 minutes from the dock. It's the second most visited cruise port in Greece. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot more to do here, although there is one very pretty shopping street. The last time I was here was before the pandemic. Among the offerings of greatest interest was internet access. Trust me, given how much a cruise ship charges for internet access, these folks had plenty of takers. Thank you for joining me today to visit the world's first Olympic village. In a short while, the 33rd Olympiad will kick off in Paris. Always remember, when you see the Olympic torch being run into Paris, they lit it right here in Olympia. Come back next time for another adventure with me here on the Armchair Traveler.